He has published more than 70 articles in legal publications and the Catholic press, and is a regular speaker for continuing legal education courses and national webinars for lawyers. He is a graduate of Thomas Aquinas College and Willamette College of Law in Salem, Oregon, where he was senior editor of the Law Review. He and his wife, Carrie, live in Santa Paula, California, where they are proud parents of 7 children and 3 grandchildren. Please help me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you so much, Virginia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia, and thank all of you for putting this together. I was told to start off with an announcement that because of the rain tonight, the event's canceled. So, but they said you're all here, so we might as well proceed. But thank you for showing up in spite of the weather. Great to have you back after part 1. Fasten your seatbelts because I've got so much stuff. It's so I can't resist myself. There's always more and more stuff that I keep thinking, I need to add this in, and so I'll fly through it and respect your time as well. So part 2 tonight, we'll talk about 2 things. We're going to talk about the Roman trial and the crucifixion. Of course, last time we talked about the arrest of Jesus and about the Jewish trial, which is hard to summarize, as you saw, in a short hour and a half. I've got hours of material, and trying to pack it in and figure out what to cut out and leave in is always a hard part. But the same is true for part 2 as well when we talk about the Roman trial and crucifixion. Since this is going to be uploaded on the internet, and I need to make this clear because when people, discuss the trial of Jesus, there are people out there who say that it leads to anti-Semitism, and I want to make crystal clear that it should not, and that a reference to anything about the Jews tonight is something from historical reference and does not apply to the Jews of today, and that we do recognize that throughout the centuries, the Jews have been persecuted for the death of Christ. The church deplores such persecution whatsoever, and the Jews remain God's chosen people to this day. We are responsible for the death of Christ, and that's enough for us to reflect on. And that's why the Vatican II Declaration on the Relation of the Church to Non-Christian Religions says, "True, the Jewish authorities and those who followed their lead pressed for the death of Christ. Still, what happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews without distinction, then alive, nor against the Jews of today." All right, when we last left off, we started, of course, here with Jesus down in the Last Supper room, and then had either gone through this gate here or through this gate up here, and was at the Garden of Gethsemane, and then was met with the mob and arrested and brought all the way back down here to the high priest's house where they had the trial. Now we're going to shift and we're going to move to the Jewish, to the Roman trial. Again, this is another map of the city. There's a hill right here, and a little bit of a trough in between here and the temple. Up above here on the right is where the Mount of Olives is, and this is the Kidron Valley here, a steep little valley, not more than a couple hundred yards wide at the upper part there. But now we're going to move to 2 different areas. We're going to move to this area here, which is Herod the Great's palace, which is one place we're talking about. Herod the Lesser lived in this smaller place here, and then the Fortress of Antonia figures in as well. So those are the 3 places we're going to look at tonight. And again, you see them marked on the map as a nice visual. So let's talk about Pontius Pilate. Who was he? Well, he was from the Pontii clan, which was a Samnite family south of Rome. Pontius refers to the gens or tribe that he belonged to, and Pilate was his family name. His first name, we just don't know through history. It could have been Gus or Bob or Cliff or something like that, but unfortunately we don't know. Many Romans had 3 names that would identify themselves by these, and Pontius Pilate had one, but we just don't know what it was. He was from a knightly family, which we know, which was an equestrian rank, and as you might imagine from the term equestrian, means you were on horseback, and if you were on horseback, you could buy a horse, and if you could buy a horse, you had some money, so you had some money, enough to buy a horse, but not so rich that you would be from the senatorial class. You'd be a kind of nobility that he came from. His name comes from one of two words, either pileus, which means cap or helmet, or the Latin pilum, which means spear or javelin. And if you're like those who like to read into people's names and about what they are and they do, then either of these words is fitting for Pilate, because he was the guy who put on the helmet and hunkered down and dealt with this problem, or he was the guy who ordered the spear into the side of Christ and was a javelin. So both names are ironically fitting for him. You know, in much of the 20th century, particularly the early 20th century and late 19th century, it was fashionable for historians to pop up and discredit and disclaim all the writings of Scripture. And for a long time, people said Pontius Pilate was just a fiction of the early Christians. He really didn't exist. And, you know, when you say things like that, you get in the cover of Time magazine and you get your 15 minutes of fame and everybody says, ooh, ah. And then about 15 years later or so, scholarship comes back and rebuts it, and you're not on Time magazine when that happens. But this was kind of interesting because in 1961, they pulled up a stone out of the ocean, and it had Pontius Pilate's name on it, right there by Caesarea where he lived, and I'll show you that in a minute. But that kind of ended the doubt about whether this guy was just made up by Christians or not. You only see half of it here. The historians are all agreed on, you know, that it's dedication to Tiberius and it's Pontius Pilatus. And again, we don't have Cliff or Bob over here on this side, so we still don't know. We need to dig up another stone out of the ocean and maybe figure out what his first name was. What was his job? What was he supposed to do? Well, we know this much from Tiberius and his criteria for the governors. You had to be of decent behavior, you had to be of good character, but you had to be less than outstanding. If you were really outstanding, you'd be a threat to him, and he'd kill you. So really, people didn't apply for the job if they thought that they were going to be better than Tiberius was. So, you know, you were modest credentials for this, and then you wouldn't be a threat to him. If you got the appointment for Judea, it wasn't a great job. You know, it wasn't what they call a plum appointment. If you were really hot, you would get, you know, Egypt or Syria, because that's where the real action and commerce was. So Pilate's job, though, was pretty clear in its details, and this much we know from what was for the other procurators too. He was supposed to secure tax revenues, keep the money coming in. That's his main job. Keep peace, don't start fights, establish trade with Rome. Remember, you know, this is an easy thing for Rome to do. They wanted to build up their wealth. You know, we'll make you rich, we'll be rich, we'll have an empire. Want to join us? And that was pretty simple. They did not want to colonize the territory. Again, all roads would lead to Rome because they would make trade and they would make empire and they would build and expand their empire through that. And so Pilate's job was to assist in doing that. He was also supposed to be the eyes and ears of Tiberius. Every procurator was. They would keep a minute record of everything daily. They would write on thin leaves of wood that would be coated with wax, and they would bind them up in bundles and send them by ship regularly to Rome. And then Tiberius, when he was being carted around to, you know, from one place to another to his orgy compound over on the coast, his aides would unpack these and read them to him and tell them what was going on in the provinces. Boy, you heard me talk last time about archaeology. Wouldn't it be great to dig up some of those, you know, leaves somewhere? But, you know, you can thank the barbarians why we don't have any of those left. He was the chief in several respects. He was the chief military officer. He was the chief judge and magistrate. He was the chief fiscal officer. He was also the chief entertainment provider. When you hear about circus and bread, he was in charge of all that. The red carts, the green carts, the white cart races, the chariot races, he arranged for that. He provided the entertainment for everybody and made sure everybody got happy. And he was also the chief bribe acceptor. Cicero, in fact, complimented one of his friends on getting an appointment as a procurator because he said, now you can finally get what's coming to you. It's a practice still regularly enforced in plenty of places in the world today, and it wasn't unknown to them either. You know, the more you could get your your palms greased while you're doing your job and not, create a war while you're doing it, good for you. As a military ruler, he was the master and commander of all the troops. So he had about 4,000 men under him in Judea. Now, one of the misconceptions you see whenever you see a movie about, Jesus' time, or read anything about it, we're always captivated by the description of centurions and Roman guards and and so forth. But the very, very few Romans were actually dispatched that far away. If you think about it, you grew up in Rome and you grew up in some other place, why would you want to go to, Palestine? There are plenty, stay home. And so, the Romans understood that, so they recruited from the locals. And the locals were great. They got lots of Samaritans and Syrians, and the best kind of people you could get for you were people who hated the Jews. So most of the Roman soldiers that you think about that were part of that 4,000 were local indigenous people who actually hated the Jews and were happy to be, ruling them with a stick. And you can see, again, the hostility that existed there. One of the reasons why the Jews hated the Romans so much is because they put these these people who hated them right in their midst to have them rule them and be the cops of the place. Now, with this, and because of that, you had this enormous clash of cultures that existed. The Jews thought that they were superior to all. In fact, if you ask a good Jew to this day, you ask him, why did God create the world? He'd say, because he wanted to give it to the Jews. And he's partly right about that, because he did. And that's why God created the world. And he started in Genesis, and he came right on through Abraham and Moses and all the prophets, and said they are a special nation and made them a special nation. So to be subjugated by a foreign power, you can imagine how it bristled them greatly. Well, the Romans, these are people who built colosseums and aqueducts and massive public projects. They thought they should rule the world. Why should you have these crazy people with all these goofy, practices and superstitions, and they have to wash their hands and circumcision? Are you kidding me? Who would do that? They would talk about these things, and they would poke them and go and jibe them about it, and back and forth it would go, and they were very serious about it. And so you can imagine the hatred that would build up between the two of them over this. How dare you think you're better than I am? Yeah, we're better than you. You get a sense of that, and we'll come to it later when even Pilate, in his conversation with Jesus, says, "Am I a Jew?" What a rhetorical question! Like, of course you know that I'm not a Jew, and that I wouldn't, have any sympathy for your odd practices. But the Romans were smart. They accommodated the Jews very, very well. Among other things, they exempted them from Sabbath court appearances. We understand Sunday, and they understood Saturday as the Sabbath. And, just as we shut down, well, the Romans didn't, and the Jews did, and yet the Romans respected that. They let them shut down. They avoided touching money from the first fruits that would be dedicated in the temple. They made it a Roman crime if anybody committed a sacrilege or had stolen their holy books or sacred money. That wouldn't be just a religious crime, that'd be a Roman crime. I love this one. The Romans also paid to have one bull and 2 goats sacrificed daily in the temple for Tiberius' safety. Talk about hedging bets, right? What did Pilate look like? Well, we know 2 things about him. He was short-haired and clean-shaven. We know he was also about 30 years old, because that was the minimum age for governors. And when he was in military garb, he'd wear a leather tunic with a breastplate, and if he was in state dress, he'd wear a white toga with a purple border. So this, was a fair description from the Passion of the Christ. There he is with his nice breastplate and looking very military-like. And then this is a good example of what he might have looked in state dress, with the cloak over the shoulder, the purple designating kingly and royal aspect. There's another nice one, too. He could look like this. Pay no attention to the Rolex watch the guy's wearing, but I'm sure he didn't have that. And yet another decent description of him from the movie that came out a couple of years ago on the soldier. Well, what do we know about him? We know some details through history, and they're actually quite revealing about him. We know some basic facts. He came to Judea in the year 26 AD. He was the 5th of the procurators that came to Rome at this time. And he lived at Caesarea, about 60 miles away. And this was up on the coast. You can see, you're tempted to think that he lived in Jerusalem. He did not. He lived over here on the coast, which was an amazing maritime city built by Herod. This is what it looks like today. It has this huge breakwater around it. Ships would come in from around the world. They'd usually travel between April and October, and then when the winter weather would set in, they'd have to take the long hike around by land. But this was a wonderful seaport, and there have been some great archaeological findings around it. This was a marble balustrade that went about 1.25 miles around this, and then the city was laid out here with public entertainment along the way. Now, apparently, I'd love to go there sometime, and maybe some of you actually have, but if you do go there, these marble stones are down deep in the water still. In fact, that stone that I showed you about with the name of Pilate on it, that's where this was found, right there, deep in the water. Another great look of how this looks. That's what I love about the internet, right? You can find these great pictures, and then I can show them to you, and you can see what it looks like. But another great shot. And again, Caesarea. If you see down here, there's an amphitheater here, and then there's a racetrack up here. And I'm going to talk about that racetrack in just a second. These are what the ruins look like today. This was the place where, the storerooms underneath the palace where Pilate lived. And again, a shot of the amphitheater that was there, which held somewhere around 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people in it. So there are 5 incidents that we know about him. 3 come from the Jewish historian Josephus, 1 from the Jewish historian Philo, and 1 from the Gospel of Luke. So let's go through these because they tell us something about him. When he came to Judea in 26 AD, he came with an amazing show of force. He decided to enter Jerusalem at night, and he posted flags around the city, and they went back to Caesarea, 60 miles away. Well, this angered the Jews greatly because they understood that no images should be allowed in the sacred city. And apparently, we don't know a lot about the flags that he posted, but they must have had images on them, and they offended the Jews. So the Jews lobbied Pilate and said, you need to take these down. And they had this huge standoff in the Hippodrome, back up in Caesarea. This is what it looked like then. It was one of those racetracks, again, where the white cars and green chariots would race against each other. And over the course of 5 days, there were 5,000 Jews that gathered here and chanted and picketed and rallied and said, Pilate, take down the flags. Pilate, take down the flags. And on the 5th day, a remarkable thing happened. Pilate got all of his soldiers to surround them. And then on cue, he had them draw their swords as if to slay them. The Jews had been prepared for this, and they were really smart. They bowed down on the ground, they pulled their cloaks over their necks, they bared their necks to them and said, kill us. We would rather die than have our sacred city defiled. Now, what do you think Pilate's going to do with his first week on the job? Kill 5,000 Jews? He backed off. He backed off. And that was fascinating for their future development, because at that point the Jews said, we know how to get this guy. We know how to push his buttons. And you can imagine Pilate, because he didn't think through what would happen next. That's his biggest mistake, and we see this come through throughout. We'll see it through the trial of Jesus. He never played the what happens next game. He didn't think things through. He was rash. There's a historian that sums this up. Oops, I got another picture I found there. I love seeing these things, and you imagine the chariot races and all the people in the throngs and rallying around. Anyhow, one historian offers this wonderful summation. He says, it's a curious mixture of provocation, indecision, stubbornness, and finally weakness. It's a really great kind of summary about what happened with this episode that you see reflected elsewhere. A second incident we know is related to this, and we don't know exactly when it happened, but apparently it occurred at a time when Pilate was staying in Herod's palace in Jerusalem. This was a model of Herod's palace. When I showed you some images last time we were together, we were talking about the Holy Land Hotel and the 1 acre model they have. Well, this is from that, and this is a depiction of what Herod the Great's palace is, not Herod the Lesser, Herod the Great. And Pilate was staying there, and what he had done is he set up something called Votive Tablets. I'm not quite sure what they are. Historians really don't know. But there's, again, it was something about some kind of prayer tablet or image that had an image on it. And it was dedicated to Tiberius. And Pilate's thinking, how could I go wrong? I'm showing my loyalty to my boss. Well, the Jews didn't like it. They asked him to take it down. He refused. So they protested Tiberius. And they said, Pilate, Tiberius, please, he's profaning our city. Make him take it down. And so Tiberius writes Pilate and says, take him down. Stop antagonizing the people. You don't need to do this kind of thing. Yes, I understand you're loyal to me, but you don't need to, do it at the expense of angering them. What does that tell you? They got this guy. They know how to push his buttons. They know how to go over his head. They know how to threaten him. And this was another episode in the life. And you think Pilate liked that and was aware of it? No. The third incident we know is from the Gospel of Luke. It was on the eve of Jesus' second Passover. And Pilate had apparently slaughtered Galileans in the temple forecourt while they were offering sacrifices. And their blood was mingled with the blood of the sacrifices, and this angered the Jews greatly. This is a good model of the temple. You have the temple here where the Holy of Holies was kept, and where the high priest would go in once a year on the Feast of the Atonement. And then here was the altar, and it was in this forecourt area where blood was. I'm still looking for a model that has all the animals that we'd have, scattered around, and all the blood and the smoke and everything pouring around. Anyhow, there was a skirmish there, and you get the blood of Galileans mixed up with the blood of the sacrifices, and not a good thing. Now, there was a fourth incident. This comes from Philo, and he says that the Romans were building a water conduit to Jerusalem, and Pilate started using temple treasury funds to pay for it. So he started pilfering out of the temple treasury. Again, you get a bunch of protesters assembled one time when Pilate's in Jerusalem, and he, does something like he did at the first incident. He gets his soldiers, he gets them all around in a big circle, they pull out their cudgels, and they beat them. And he kills many of them, and it was his comeuppance. It was like, fine, you thought you could get away with it up at Caesarea? Not here. And so he beat them badly, and that, touche, as he thought. Now, what did others think of him at the time? Well, we've got three references in history. Philo, the Jewish historian, greatly disliked him. We know that. Josephus says he was of an unbending and ruthlessly hard character. But you remember when we talked last time, Josephus has some potential credibility problems because he was the Benedict Arnold of the Jewish people, and so a lot of what he says is quite self-serving to the Romans, who he was now in service for. King Herod Agrippa says, quote, corruption, violence, robbery, oppression, humiliations, constant executions without trial, and unlimited intolerable cruelty were the order of the day. All right, so is Pilate these things? Not really. It is a tad unfair. If you look at him on balance, for one thing, this fact stands alone. Tiberius let him reign for 10 years. 10 years is a long time in the life of a procurator. Second, the gospel accounts, as we'll see, show that Pilate really showed scruples in how he handled Jesus. He didn't just cast him off and say off with his head. He was willing to listen. And plus, we also see from the accounts that he was no fool. He knew exactly what the Jews were up to when they brought Jesus to him. So let's turn then to the Praetorium and where the trial actually occurs. We know that the Jews escort Jesus to Pilate. They don't enter to avoid ritual defilement. And one of the things that has perplexed historians to this day is they don't know why. They don't know why the Jews thought that you would be defiled by going into a pagan place. There's speculation as well, would you encounter some unleavened bread, or leavened bread, since it was during the Feast of Unleavened? Well, there's no prohibition on that. There's nothing in the Levitical law that says that you can't go into a pagan household during a high feast day. But what's strange is that the gospel writers just assume that's the case, that you just can't go in. And so they say, well, they didn't enter to avoid ritual defilement, even though we don't really know why. But we all know that he was at the Praetorium. Everybody knows, yes, Jesus it was before Pilate the Praetorium. Where's that? We don't know. Because the term was a term of placement, and it was a moving term. The term literally meant the camp tent of the army leader. And then by extension, it was used to refer to where the governor lived or resided. We don't know where Pilate was living when he came to town that particular day. And so that's why we've got this problem when everybody says, oh, well, gee, they brought him to the Praetorium. Where's that? It would have been helpful if they would have told us, because we really don't know. So there are two candidates that we look at in determining where the Praetorium was. One of them is the Fortress of Antonia. We saw that before. That was that massive structure built by Herod the Great in the earlier years, dedicated to Mark Antony over one of his victories. And this was built to overlook the temple grounds and keep an eye on all the rabble that was there. That was the place where the cohort would be. You could get 600 soldiers packed into that place. And so it makes sense. You get the commander of the soldiers, he'd be there, get to hang out with the guys, roll some dice, drink some Egyptian beer, and keep an eye on the locals. Might be a place where you stay. This, of course, was up here. The other place, though, is Herod's palace, Herod the Great's palace. He stayed there a lot, too. And that also could have been the Praetorium. It was a magnificent construct, as you can imagine, with somebody the size and ego and wealth that Herod the Great had. It had all kinds of rooms, amazing descriptions. This is the image we saw before with the massive courtyard and the layered, rooms that it had. There's wonderful, speculation. Architects love, kind of trying to redo what Herod's palace looked like on this. There's actually a place in Spain that was reportedly built along the same model as Herod's temple. And this is an interior courtyard of it. This is a place where you had marble floors, where servants were constantly dusting the floor, walking around with platters of grape leaves to eat, and figs and local wines. And doves would be placed around just so they could flutter around, and you could see soft little, feathers fly around the place. It was a really nice place to stay. So we, where was Pilate? Was he going to, if you had your chance to stay with the soldiers in the barracks, or would you camp out at the Ritz? I think I know where I would stay. And so unless Pilate had some special reason, you'd think that he would be, staying at the Ritz. Why is Pilate, though, involved? What's going on with him now? Just to revisit this, we talked about last time, that the Sanhedrin was able to have a trial for capital crimes where there'd be death involved, but they couldn't execute on him because only the right of the sword was reserved to Rome at that point. So Pilate's role at this point is fairly straightforward. He's supposed to hear trials. He's able to hear this trial too on a capital crime that's come to him, but he does very simple things. He's supposed to make independent findings. He's supposed to enforce capital crimes under Roman law, but he's not supposed to get involved in Jewish law. And we see that happen a number of times elsewhere in Scripture. When the Jews denounced Paul in Corinth, the Roman consul Gallio said, "If these are your questions of doctrine and titles of your law, look to it yourselves. I have no wish to decide such matters." That would have been Pilate's policy too. Another example, when the Roman tribune Claudius Lysias took Paul under protection for the Jews in Jerusalem, it was because the charges related only to disputed issues of Jewish law. So he was protecting Paul from his own people because of that. Festus, another Roman governor of Caesarea, he showed no interest in Paul when it was clear that only Jewish law was involved. Again, and Paul would use this to advantage. He'd pull out his Roman citizenship card and say, "See, I'm a Roman citizen. You see these guys over here? They're after me because of their Jewish law. I am, you have no jurisdiction over me," and it would work. The Romans got it. And so Pilate knew that too. Generally, trials before Roman procurators were fairly straightforward and simple. You had the Roman governor, who would be a single judge. With him would be junior barristers and attendants. lawyers in waiting, others who are trained in the law, understand precedent, understand culture, understand the dynamic involved. They could brief him on things like that and tell him, remind him what the Justinian Code was. Well, Justinian came later, but it codified what he knew then. And they would talk about ways to handle the situation. So he wouldn't have been alone. He would have had people with him to help him out. The proceedings were public. That's why to this day, in the United States, under our Constitution, we have public trials, because there's a vestige of what happened in the Roman Republic, is that trials are supposed to be open to the public. And that's why Pilate didn't need to be educated by the New York Times about this. This is something that he understood as clear, that if you're going to have a trial, you have it in the open. And it's still recognized in most places in the world today, except in totalitarian places where they don't have public trials, and they have them in secret, which is why they're not just. Anyhow, this is something that comes from the Romans, and we're thankful for it. What's also interesting is that the proceedings were done in Greek in the eastern provinces. Was Jesus' trial done in Greek? We don't know. Were Roman trials in Jerusalem done in Greek? I don't know. Probably. The Jewish upper class was educated in Greek. Remember, we talked about the scope last time of Alexander's influence, and that many of the customs that even the Jews had, including their name for the Sanhedrin, was a Greek term. So the notion of Greek terms weren't foreign to them at all. And and even Jesus working as a carpenter in Nazareth, we'll show later on, he had the opportunity to know Greek himself. Of course, he was God, so he could speak Swahili. So we're not interested in that. But even as a natural matter, he could have spoken Greek just by learning it on his own. The form of the hearing was also fairly well set. They usually began just after sunrise, 6 in the morning, which seems pretty early to us. But we forget that when you're in a Mediterranean culture, you go to bed when the sun goes down, and if it's 6 o'clock-ish or so, you're going to get up early. And so they would get up early. There are plenty of stories and accounts of how Roman governors and Roman generals and others would be at their desks by 2 or 3 in the morning, starting their day and ready to go. So to have your business start at 6 in the morning was not unusual, and it fits here too. The proceedings would open with the summoning of the parties, just like our courts and trials do too. You probably had a clerk who would have a docket and would say, okay, on our docket today we have these 5 or 6 cases. Is everybody here? And they do a checking around. No, well, Ishmael's coming later, so let's worry about him later. You move up to number 2 or 3. I like to think about how the Jews did this when they were bringing Jesus from Caiaphas's house, because they had to get on Pilate's docket too that morning. So they obviously were sending somebody over, quick, get on Pilate's docket. And if they paid Judas 30 pieces of silver, to get the guy turned over, what do you think they'd get to be number 1 on the docket that day? They had to get, him on the docket, because time was a wasting. The plaintiff then would utter an indictment. So the person who was, prosecuting somebody or suing somebody, as it were, would come forward and say, I'm suing him because he stole this, or his, cows, ran over my field, or he took my chariot, or whatever. The plaintiff would state that, and then the defendant would state his defense. What say you to this? I couldn't control my cow, or he incited my cow over there, or whatever. The defendant would offer an explanation for what he had done. The examinations were straightforward. The judge would examine the parties. Unlike our trials today, where the parties get the right of cross-examination against each other, or the right to even direct examine each other, in this case, these kinds of trials, certainly and especially those in the frontier regions, were done where the judge was. So it'd be a lot like parents. A parent holding a trial in front of 2 squabbling kids. Stop. Okay, no. What's your problem? He's kicking me. He's pinching me. Did you kick him? Yeah, but he bit me first, right? So the judge is in control of that conversation between the parties and would examine. Now, you'd have to think, though, that just like a parent dealing with squabbling kids, when they don't get the right to cross, so the one is going to say, ask him whether he bit me first, right? Ask him that. Well, that's going to happen. And so the parties would we get that, and of course the rules were fairly broad and open, but I think that even the rules that we have to this day in our courts, which are the hearsay rule, the relevance rule, materiality, those foundational rules, those are all based on fairness. They really are. And you'd have to think that the same kinds of rules would have operated back then too. So the evidence wasn't subject to formal procedure. You can imagine these are times of pressure, times of feast. It's like, get to the point. So just like a harried parent's like, I don't have all day, kids. What's going on? What's your problem? And so they get right to the nub of it, pretty quickly, and not, well, Your Honor, I need a continuance and I need time to collect this. No. Tell me your case. Tell me your case. And then they reach a decision. So there was a free assessment of testimony that would be allowed and afforded to the judge like this. And as you can imagine, that the chief means of proof are going to be what testimony is given by the witnesses and the statements of the defendant. And, just as parents think that they're a pretty good judge about what kid is telling the truth and what kid is not, I'm sure Roman procurators thought they were pretty good too. You can tell, you get to look in the guy's eyes, the defendant's eyes, is he squirming? Does he seem nervous? Is he lying? And you're going to make determinations based on that. And then findings of guilt as well. So that's how trials would have been done normally throughout the empire. And we see, and then finally, you'd issue a ruling. The judge then would say, okay, I've heard enough, thank you. He'd retreat, huddle with the assistants. What do you think? I think that guy's a liar. What do you think about him? Yeah, pretty good, but he's pretty slimy too. What do you think we should do? You know what? So, what do we do in that other case? Well, remember, this is what you did before. So there's a consultation going on, and it's certainly an attempt to follow a rule of reason, which is a good thing. The judge then, when he would make his decision, he would come out, and he would sit on a judgment seat. He'd sit down, and he'd say, here's my decision. And of course, he'd do it in Greek, right? And he'd do it with a herald who would shout it out. They'd get to a megaphone. They want to make sure that everybody heard. These are public proceedings, no doubt about it. So everybody would, somebody would, if the judge couldn't bark it out, a herald would do it for him and say, this is the finding, guilty or innocence based on it. And then, sentence carried out immediately. No appeal, right? He's the highest judge in the land. You don't get to say, wait a second, I want to go back to Rome and I want to have the emperor. No, sorry, you know what? Your boat already sailed. You're done. I found you guilty. You're over. Unless you had some special political connection that you could appeal to that would be above them, it just wasn't going to happen. The sentence was going to happen right then and there. And they didn't. It's not like they had prisons or anything, or penitentiaries as we call them, right? Which was formed because it was a place where you go and become penitent. And the Quakers wanted it back in the 18th century, which was go to a place with a Bible alone and repent for what you did. We don't have that now. Penitentiaries are a very different place than that. They didn't have even those, so there was no place to, you had to execute the sentence right then and there. If it involved beating or flogging of some kind, maybe sometimes there were holding cells for places like that or debtors' prisons, but generally it was not good what was going to happen to you. All of this seems to be reflected in Jesus' trial. The Sanhedrin trial ended at about 6 in the morning. And it says they brought him to Pilate without delay, right? So when we saw last time, it says, and day was breaking when the trial came to an end. They went and conferred, they bound him, and then they brought him to Pilate, which is about a 10-minute walk, depending if you're going to walk from, where they were at Caiaphas' house up to the left to go to the Praetorium where Herod's place was, or if they were going to go across to the Fortress of Antonia. It wasn't going to take too long, and they got him there without delay, and probably made sure that he was going to be first on the docket. One of the reasons why the Sanhedrin likely held that trial at night is because they wanted that Roman trial to occur at sunrise, because as they had said before, we need to arrest him, but not on the feast, not on Passover, because there's too much going on. It's like, as I mentioned before, it's like Super Bowl Sunday. You're not going to get people out, but we do it before we can get them. So let's get the trial done anytime, because there's nothing that stops us from having a trial at night, and then bring him to Pilate for the first trial on the day before Passover. What were they thinking, though? Remember from part 1, what did they try him for? What did they convict him of? Blasphemy. But it's not a crime under Roman law. We saw that. We know that much. But they had arrested him. They succeeded. They nabbed the guy. They had him in his grasp. They're thinking, okay, all right, look, we got to bring this to Pilate. What's Pilate going to say? We can't tell him it's a blasphemy. What do we do? Well, don't worry. We'll just make it up when we get there. What we'll do is we'll spin this. We'll spin this into a political crime. They're going to rally Jewish sentiment against Jesus, and they're going to spin it into something else, and they're going to force Pilate's hand. And that's exactly what they did. They were able to pull it off. This was a spin job of enormous proportions because nothing that they could bring to Pilate was going to be anything that Pilate was able to have jurisdiction over. That's why the Acts of the Apostles, we find this wonderful reference that says, even though they found no charge against him which deserved death, they begged Pilate to have him executed. Begged. It's a really interesting word because it was much more than a beg that happened. So we start with this, very first exchange. Pilate, what accusation do you bring against this man? The Jews. If he were not a criminal, we wouldn't have handed him over to you. What does that tell you? They don't want to tell him. A little testy, huh? Pilate gets that. Pilate says, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. What does that tell you? Pilate knew. He'd been briefed in advance. Somebody came to him when he said, what's on our docket today? We got this Jesus of some Nazarene guy, and the Jews hate this guy because he thinks he's God or something like that. What? We're not involved in that. I know. Well, why'd they bring him to us? I don't know. Well, I have to ask him. So what accusation do you bring? And they said, and so he knew. Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. Been briefed in advance. The Jews, well, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. Capital crime? Why are they bringing me a capital crime? He has to be thinking. What did Pilate know about Jesus? Did he know about him in advance? Probably. If he were a good Roman governor, he would use spies, just like all the other governors did, just like we all do today. If you're going to be in power, you got to hold on to it, so you got to have spies. You know what your enemies are doing. They would have been reporting on Jesus' activity. Don't you think that he would have heard news of that short little, fat tax collector who he had to pull down out of a sycamore tree one day and said, hey, Jesus said, I'm coming to your house for dinner. And then he has him for dinner, and Zacchaeus says, I give up everything. I'm going to give, back fourfold everything that I've taken, from anybody before. And I promise not to do it again. Pilate's thinking to himself, what tax collector does that? He knew that tax collectors were crooked and wrong. Didn't you think the story get back to him? Hey, Pilate, we have an honest tax collector here. Are you kidding me? Why did that happen? Well, he met this guy and he was up in a sycamore tree trying to look at him. Well, that's, do you think word would get back to him on this? How about the centurion? This is a wonderful story. This is a centurion, you remember? He says, my son's sick. He says, Lord, I need you to come heal him. But he says, I know you're a man of authority and orders. Just you don't have to come. Jesus says, would you like me to come? It's a really interesting passage in Luke. He says, would you like me to come? He goes, no, you don't have to come. I'm a man of authority. I can tell people to go, and they go. I can tell people to come, and they come. You're the same way. Just tell me he's fine, work. And at that very hour, his son was cured, right? So imagine that when news gets back to the barracks, right? And the centurion says, you'll never guess what happened, right? Do you think the stories happened? Do you think it reached up to Pilate like, has this guy gone native? Do we need to check him out? What's the story here, Mr. Centurion? These stories would get around the barracks, and they would probably get their way to Pilate, and he was probably very curious about these things. So Pilate grabs his morning espresso, and he decides to have his interrogation with the prisoner. He says, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus, you've said so. Remember, that's that same phrase we talked about last time, which is like, you bet, yes, in a colloquial Semitic way of saying that. Pilate then at this point decides to ask the Jews for information. We don't get much from this exchange. Maybe there are more words than this, but Pilate's got kind of a problem here because he asks him, are you the king of the Jews? And the guy says, yeah. I thought this was going to be an easy case. I better go get some more info here. So he goes out to the Jews. What do you say about this? Remember, he has to go in and out. And by the way, one of the things, there's so many things about this that sorry, if I make this longer, you got to know these things, right? Gospel of John is so amazing. It's so rich in details. But go back and read through this. You'll see from the excerpt that I have here, I've got all the gospel parts out. But in the Gospel of John, there's this amazing pattern where every time Pilate talks to Jesus, Jesus is inside in the dark, and Pilate is talking to the light of the world. And Pilate then goes outside into the light, and he faces darkness. And this is called, what scholars call this is a chiastic reference, because there's a parallel structure going on. And John just sets this up wonderfully, chillingly beautiful, because you see Pilate and his mind and what is going on, and the light of the world in the dark, and the darkness out in the light. Anyhow, this part of this here. So when Pilate talks to the Jews here, Luke tells us, he says, he's stirring up the people, teaching throughout all Judea and beginning from Galilee even to this place. Pilate then says, have you no answer? See how many things they accuse you of. Jesus is silent. How many cases do you think Pilate's had where a defendant is silent? Right? And he's on trial for his life. Imagine what Pilate's thinking, this guy, they want to kill this guy? I just asked him, what's your defense? Remember, he's trying to follow process. Plaintiff under indictment, defendant gets to state his defense. I've heard the plaintiff. They say you're stirring up people. What say you? Silence. He was waiting for the groveling, for the defensive. No, I really wasn't. Or, I had excuses, whatever it was. The defendant is silent. So Pilate's got this dilemma. What does he do? Because Luke and Mark both say, for reasons that are very curious, as if they know what Pilate was thinking at this point, which may have been leaked through all kinds of different sources going on, that Pilate at this point in the proceedings did not believe Jesus was guilty. And he realized also that the chief priests were acting out of envy. But the problem is this. He had a yes to deal with. Are you the king of the Jews? Yeah. How's Tiberius going to handle this? He's thinking to himself. So he can't just drop the proceedings. He's got to go forward with it. He has to figure out, what does this yes mean and what's the implications of it? So he resumes the interrogation. Pilate, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus, are you saying this yourself, or have others told you about me? Any direct answers? Like, well, what do you think? You have spies. Do you talk to Zacchaeus? Do you talk to the centurion? What'd they say? Right? Pilate, am I a Jew? Your own people and the chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done? See, he's curious. He wants to know. It's not like, look, if he were some bloodthirsty guy and said, throw the guy, kill the SOB, throw him down the stairs, you can't go crucify him. He didn't do that. He wants to know. He's genuinely interested in what's going on here. And you can imagine, you're looking the Lord of the universe in the eyes at this point, right? What are you going to see when you see that? You can be a little intimidated or not. I think so. Jesus, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my followers would have fought that I might not be delivered to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. Do you think a hair rose up on the back of his neck at that point? Think of this guy who was steeped in all the pagan pieties of the wars between the gods, and sometimes they would come down in your midst and really mess your life up. You think maybe he was thinking this is possible? Maybe. But what he heard from this is he says, you are then a king. So he got an admission. He admitted he's a king. Jesus, you said it. I am a king. This is why I was born and why I've come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who's of the truth hears my voice. What do you say to that? He's thinking. Well, Pilate utters the most famous line that comes down to us through history. Says, what is truth? But it's completely without context. We don't know what was on his face when he said it. Was he some pompous ass of a college professor who says, wow, what is truth? Was he being sarcastic, or was he, what's it all about, Alfie? What is truth? I don't know. Was he being introspective? We don't know. So that's why so many diverse legends have risen up over Pilate over the years. Was he a good guy? Was he a bad guy? Was he in between? You get some red meat to argue on both sides for that. Anyhow, This is the most interesting thing about this exchange. He just interrogated Jesus. He got an admission that he says he's a king, and he says his kingdom's not of this world, but he is a king. And Pilate then goes out immediately and declares to the Jews, I find no guilt in him. I find no guilt in him. He's innocent. Trial's over, done, go home, bye, you know what, have a nice time. Next case, call the next case clerk. That's what he could have done at that point. And he didn't do it, though. This is Pilate, again, not thinking through things, the what happens next game. Because at some point, there's probably some political advisor, some damn political advisor said to him, hey, Pilate, you know, the guy's from Galilee, so really he's not in our jurisdiction. You know, Herod, he's in town for the feast. Let's kick it over to Herod. Guess what? It'll save you. Because you know what? He was just a couple months ago, he fed 5,000 people with some loaves and fishes, they say. Guy was walking on the water and stuff. You don't want to get angry, 5,000 people angry like that. Just duck it. Just let him go. And besides, if you let him go completely, you're going to anger all the chief priests, and you know how they are, and they're messy, and they're always rebellion. Just send him to Herod. Make it his problem. And Pilate's probably thinking, yeah, good idea. And he never said, well, what happens if Herod sends him back? There's nothing that required Pilate to do this. This was pure predilection on his part. And why he did it is completely unclear and, in the end, stupid by his standards, because he couldn't predict what would happen if Herod sends him back. So Jesus goes to Herod. This is a wonderful image of this guy. I love this from the movie. The movie got so much flack, and it really didn't deserve it. There's so much right about it, and this is really right about Herod. Herod was the youngest and cleverest son of Herod the Great. He had reigned over Galilee and Perea in the north since 4 BC, when his father died, or 3 BC, if Josephus is wrong about the date. So he'd been ruling for about 30 years at this point. As we saw before, this is Judea. This was the vacant area that was part of the old man's kingdom. And then Herod Antipas had this area here, up in Galilee and here. And then his brother had the Golan Heights and this area up in here, and he was just kind of off in no man's land. But this guy was clever. He was in power for a long time, and he really tried to curry favor with the Romans and say, hey, I know my brother screwed up, but, please, oh, buddy, oh, Roman nose, would you let me back in? I just want to stay in my dad's palace. Can we do that? And the Romans said, thank you very much, but we're fine. We've worked it out. No, nothing personal to you, Herod, but we just kind of like the arrangement that we have it now. You are the ethnarch. That means you get to rule your people up there. So this is where Herod lived. He lived in, this is where his main rule was in Tiberias, named after Tiberias, right, on the Sea of Galilee. Guess who named after Tiberias? It was the old man did, because he was currying favor. That's why he got to be in power so long. He curried favor with the Romans. This is a great reconstruction of what it looked like at the time. And again, he had his, amphitheaters and, public projects going on all around, and a nice little seaport on there. What makes this really interesting, because, what connection did Pilate and Jesus ever have? Well, this is how the geography works. This is a town called Sepphoris, and it was a hilltop town, and it was only about 5 miles away from Nazareth, which has been about an hour walk. Some have speculated that when the Holy Family came back from Egypt and they needed a place to settle back in Galilee, that Joseph, who was a carpenter, was looking for work, and that a good place to find work would have been in a little Jewish town called Nazareth, which was walking distance to a nice public project that Herod was building, this Herod that we're talking about, because now we're in, post 4 BC, that was building. So there's some fair, reasonable, plausible explanation that maybe Jesus was doing work up on one of Herod's projects when he was working for 30 years as a carpenter with his dad. The place has not been rebuilt. The ruins are there today. That's a picture of their amphitheater. And wait, I missed one. Yeah, and that's the ruins of the hilltop there. So anyhow, that's kind of the fun part of archaeology is in speculation. about these things. But the point is that Jesus certainly knew who Herod was growing up, because he had been he may have been in his employ in one manner or another. Now, as I mentioned before, this is the place, one of the praetorium candidates was Herod's palace down here. The minor palace where the lesser Herod Antipas stayed was right here. Okay, so this is the Ritz, this is the Holiday Inn. You don't have to feel bad for him. I'm sure that he got a breakfast buffet without the bacon, and he had a nice time too. But this is another model of what it looked like. Again, nice place to stay. Now we know this, is that Herod and John had a relationship because John was the one who had paid for a dance, or Herod had paid for a dance with John's head over that. There's a fascinating reference in Mark where Herod is said, Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him, but she was not able to because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. So pretty interesting, right? He feared him, he protected him, he liked to listen to him. But dang it, he had made that deal that, he'd give his stupid stepdaughter anything she'd want, if she just asked for it, up to half his kingdom. And she said, I want his head. And so he did it. He was greatly distressed to have to kill him for that. There's even this direct reference from the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus tells messengers to Herod, go tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I reach my goal. Can you imagine what Herod thought when he heard that? He goes, that fox, he thinks I'm a fox, huh? Yeah, pretty cool. And you know what? I heard about these lepers. These guys were lepers. They're walking around. They're cured now. What's this about all the pigs going off in the ocean, by the Sea of Galilee on that other southwestern side, eastern side there? What the heck's with that? Man, I would love to see him cure a leper. Wouldn't that be really cool? This is Herod. You can think of these things. So when Jesus is brought to him, this is exactly what we find. When he first heard about Jesus, he says, this is John the Baptist. He's risen from the dead. That's why miraculous powers are at work in him. So what's interesting is Herod believed in miracles. He believed in them, and he wanted to see some for all the wrong reasons, but he was not a skeptic by any measure. He did believe in them, and he wanted to see them. Now, Jesus, what was he thinking? Well, I kind of think he was thinking this. My name is Jesus the Nazarene. You killed my cousin. Prepare to die. So Herod actually has an encounter with Jesus. He floods Jesus with questions, the Gospels say. And he doesn't take the charges seriously. So you're a king, are you, huh? I mean, this is a guy who spent his whole life trying to be king. It's like, good luck to you, pal. I tried my whole life to be king here. If you can, be great. I wish, let me know how it works out for you. I'd love to hear it. But you think about this exchange, it's not as if Herod was angered by Jesus. What? You're the Messiah? How dare you, be a teacher and a popular ruler here? He wasn't bothered by that. He could have been. He could have said, arrest this man, put him in a cart. We're going up to Galilee, and I'm going to try him for charges under my jurisdiction there because Pilate said I could. He didn't do that. It was like, you know what? Here's my wardrobe. I got a nice bright robe I got for you, pal. The King's Club, we'll call it. You're a member too. I'm a member. You're a member. We'll get other people to be members. Go have a nice time. Go back to Pilate. And that's what he did. He put a chiton on him, which is a very bright robe of some kind, intended to mock him for it and not to punish him for it. Punish him by mocking, of course. Of course, it's a sad fact in history that was the day that Pilate and Herod became friends. They probably picture themselves sitting under Solomon's portico several years later, sipping spice wine and eating, Roman honey cakes and talking, remember that day, when we had to deal with that guy, and that was a really tough job, wasn't it? That didn't happen because within less than 5 or 6 years, Pilate would be gone and lost to history, and Herod would too. So none of their dreams ever became short-lived at all through that. They actually became short because of that. How do we even know what happened? Is this just made up? No. There was a Chusa who was an official in Herod's court. And we know from the Gospel of Luke that Chusa's wife was a believer. Pillow talk? I'd like to think so. Herod also had a foster brother who was a Christian in Antioch. You think when he got around at the Herod family barbecue that he had some things to say about this? Yeah, so this is, again, in complete rebuff to those who say the gospel accounts are made up without foundation. There's full foundation for these things. So Jesus goes back to Pilate, and Luke records this. He says, Pilate was even more disinclined to find Jesus guilty. So it already says, I find no guilt in him. Now he says, I really find no guilt in him, and I want to get rid of this. So he figures, what's another way I can do this? He talks to his assistants. He says, oh, hey, we got that custom, right? We got this custom with this guy, Barabbas. Remember, we can release somebody at Passover. That's our custom, so why don't we release the guy? He didn't think about it. What was happening next? What if the crowd says no? So he offers Barabbas, this guy. He says, I'll give you 2 picks. You get Jesus, Barabbas. It's a really interesting name because, we all know enough that Abba is the name for father, right? So Bar Abba is son of the father. There's some early scriptural manuscripts that include the word Jesus before him. Jesus, son of the father. Whoa, imagine that. You got Jesus, son of the father on this side and Jesus, son of the father on this side. Literally and, metaphysically. Did the crowd misunderstand something when they said, we want Barabbas? I don't know. He's described as, the one on this side anyhow, is described as a robber or who was one in revolt. And under this tradition, this is what makes this really interesting, is that the Gospels record this as a custom in which the Jews could ask for the release of a prisoner. And the purpose was that they would be allowed to come home and partake of the Paschal meal. By the way, I want you to hold on to this thought, but we'll talk about this later, but don't forget, at least according to the Gospel of John, Passover is Friday night, not Thursday night. It's a whole separate lecture about what was going on with the Last Supper and whether that was the Passover meal, which it was, but was it on Passover? John says no. We'll talk about that separately. But Passover is Friday night, and one of the most compelling reasons why John understood this to be Passover is Friday night is you wouldn't let a guy home to go get leftovers. He's coming home for dinner. So let him loose now so that he can partake of the Pasch. All 4 of the Gospels mention this. But what's really strange is there isn't a single other historical reference to this custom. No other Jewish writings, no other Roman writings, nothing from Josephus says anything about this custom. But the Gospels mention it, and all 4 of them do. So that suggests that, again, that's not something that was made up. Pilate offers the crowd, do you wish I released to you the king of the Jews? So again, you have to think, what is he thinking? But there was a big crowd out there. It's a rabble, and he's got these high priests who are there pressing charges. Maybe he's thinking, the crowd, they love me. You know what? I'll bypass these guys. I'm going to offer the prisoner to the crowd. What say you to the crowd? Do you wish I release him to you? Because he knew at this point the chief priests were acting out of envy. But he's thinking that the crowd might not know what their particular motives are. And he never, again, was thinking through, what if the crowd is set against him? What if the crowd says, Pilate, no, we want this, gap-toothed, demon over here, Barabbas, to, release. What's he going to say then? He can think about it. So Pilate says, so at that point, the crowd says, we want Barabbas, and now he's stuck. He's still got Jesus to do. What does he do then? So he says, what then? Because he asks him, well, what am I supposed to do with this guy? What do you want to do with the king of the Jews? Crucify him. Crucify him? For what crime? Wait, I don't get this. What has he done? He's confused. He doesn't understand. Because, as his assistants would have told him, he would have turned to them and said, why are they saying crucify him? We can't do capital crimes for anything here. And they would have said, well, Pilate, under our code, the Roman code, we only do capital punishment for pretty limited situations. You got to be threatening the Roman people and their safety. You got to be deliberately and maliciously exercising the functions of official. He hasn't done either of these things. You have to maliciously cause friends of Romans to be enemies. Now, if you do those things, you're going to get killed. But he didn't done any of these things, and they hadn't charged him with any of these things. Which is why Pilate says, why? What evil has he done? Crowd ignores him. Crucify him! Crowd won't answer him. They won't tell him what evil he's done. Crowd's threatening to riot at this point. You can imagine how it is. They're whipping up in a frenzy. Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate's thinking, what do I do now? So he lets Barabbas go, and he orders Jesus scourged. Now, at this point, one of the most interesting events occurs in the whole Passion narrative is, talk about pillow talk. This is Pilate's wife. She intervenes. She sends a message to him on the bench, which apparently, as historians say, is not implausible, but pretty rare. You'd have to think it would be. That, while there's riots going on, she slips him a note and says, have nothing to do with that just man, for I've suffered many things in a dream day today because of him. One of the reasons why this is so extraordinary is that the only person in the entire Passion narrative who steps forward in Jesus' defense is a pagan woman. There's no record of Peter, John, any of the apostles, Mary Magdalene. Nobody's there saying, stop, this is a travesty. A pagan woman steps in his defense. Now Pilate, seeing that he was doing no good, but rather that a riot was breaking out, took water, washed his hands in sight of the crowd, saying, I'm innocent of the blood of this just man. See to it yourselves. Washing hands was a custom. It was well recognized by the Jews that it was symbolized innocence. This was known among pagans as well. And again, he wanted to use a Jewish custom to make sure he was understood, and especially if you think he was doing this in Greek. So, he understood maybe the chief priest could speak Greek, but maybe the rabble couldn't. So he was going to, go through the motions to let him know, I'm not responsible for this guy. You guys are. So he has him scourged. Remember, this is what's critical. He's having him scourged before he thinks he sends him to death, because he's thinking the scourging is going to diffuse it. Scourging under Roman law was actually pretty commonly described. You would strip the criminal naked, you'd bind him to a pillar or post, and you beat him until the flesh hung in shreds. If you were a freeman, you got beat with rods. If you were a military personnel, you got beat with sticks. And if you were slaves, you got beat with leather thongs fitted with spikes of metal or bone. So it'd look something like this, and of course they'd have to be high enough because the victim just couldn't stand. They would lash him all over the body, arms, legs, back, butt, calves, feet, wherever they could get it to make it painful. The whole idea was to hurt somebody so they never do what they're going to do again. Those who have looked at the Holy Shroud, though, have seen plenty of evidence for this, that in fact he was beaten with this flagrum, because they can see the marks on the shroud that indicate these leather thongs and the bones and pieces of metal there. They can even tell from the angle of the slashing about how high the guards were. Say about 5'5", 5'6", 5'7" feet tall because of the way they came in. Now the purpose again was pretty straightforward, although it's not clear here why Pilate's doing it. It was done as part of interrogation technique. So if you had somebody and you needed information, in Chicago they'd hold your head in a toilet or beat you with a rubber hose not too long ago. In some places around the world they still do that. Roman law was the same way. Beat the guy until we can get something out of him. Or it would be part of a death sentence, and especially if it was part of a military punishment too. And we'll talk about this more later in the crucifixion, but the purpose was to put people on notice that don't you ever do this, what this person did, because the same thing's going to happen to you. So it was done very much to deter future crime. It was also done as an independent police chastisement for agitators. You get a bunch of rioters, one of the ways to stop rioters, grab 3 or 4 of them, beat the hell out of them, and then tell the rest of them, same thing's coming to you, better stop. You want to be next? And it works pretty well. And it was also done as an introductory stage to an execution after a death sentence. But see, none of this fits for Jesus. In fact, John even suggested Pilate did this to save Jesus. Luke records Pilate as saying, I will therefore chastise him and release him. By the way, this is one of the reasons why and people like to say, well, we really don't know how hard Jesus was beaten. Well, we've got an indication that he was beaten as hard as possible, because if you're going to get killed, they don't beat you really hard with an inch of your life, because they want you to enjoy that time on the cross for as long as you can. What they do instead, if you're going to beat somebody within an inch of his life, it means you're going to release him. So they did beat him within an inch of his life here, which is why he had all these sufferings. So again, the Gospels don't say, but Pilate was beating him to disarm him, and that, scourgings for crucifixions were something where they wanted you to enjoy your suffering a lot longer. So that's why it was likely more severe. They also mocked him. If you were due to a Saturday Night Live sketch or something about, how to make fun of a Hellenistic king, you would do three things. You would put a purple robe on him, you would give him a staff-like scepter, and you would put a gilded wreath of leaves on his head. And everybody would go, that's a king. Yeah, right? So that's exactly what happened here. You'd have the robe, you'd have the scepter. These are actual, this is from a Greek urn. It shows, if you want to see what a Greek king looked like, he always had his staff with him. And he had a wreath. He put it on his head too. And so with Jesus, we see all these. They threw a red or purple cloak on him. They put in his hands a reed-like rod. They put on his head a wreath of thorns. And they mocked him. Hail, King of the Jews. And then they bent their knees before him as in genuflecting, and then they would spit on him, which was the mockery of a kiss instead. And they hit him all over, just for the fun of it. This, of course, fulfilled Isaiah's prophecy. I gave my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who plucked my beard, my face I did not shield from buffets and spitting. So Pilate does this, and now he brings Jesus out. Behold, I bring him out to you, that you may know I find no guilt in him. See, he's saying, I find no guilt in him. And he thought the mockery would diffuse the crowd. The crowd says, crucify him. Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. You see that rashness coming out in, Pilate again, like, yeah, fine, you guys go do it. I'm not responsible here. He's not thinking things through. Well, at this point, this is when the blasphemy charge surfaces. We have a law. And according to that law, he must die because he has made himself Son of God. Pilate's intrigued. He'd heard about the king business. The Son of God business? What's that all about? Who is this prisoner I've been staring at? So John records him bringing in for a second interrogation. Where are you from? Silence. Why do you not speak to me? Don't you know I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you? You'd have no power at all over me if it were not given you from above. See his hair raising up at that point again? This is a guy who would spend all of his time, trying to study entrails of animals, looking at birds fly through the sky, trying to, he'd wake up in the morning and offer these incense, pour oil onto grain and say a little prayer to the gods. He'd had household gods that all were within his house that Romans would have to pray for. And you have to worry about not offending them because bad things would happen to you. And he's thinking, this guy, is he one of them? He had all these pagan pieties. What animals did he look at that week where he opened a chicken and looked in its guts and somebody said, ooh, bad sign, Pilate. What? What bad sign? He was spooked by these things. He had to be. At this point, he says, I got to release him. I don't want anything to do with him. I got to let this guy go. And that's what he tried. But the Jews step in. If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Remember, they pulled his chain before. They got him at least 2 other times when they went over his head and they threatened him. And they knew, and he knew, that he was going to do it. So that's why, and Paul says, though they could charge him with nothing deserving death, yet they asked Pilate to have him killed. They were going to denounce him, and he knew they'd do it, and they knew, and he knew he'd be facing denouncement for releasing a claimed king. At that point, that's where cowardice steps in. He could have said, I don't care. I am not going to condemn an innocent man. But he thought of this guy, his boss. This was Tiberius. This is, nice little college shot from Kappa Kappa Gamma, and again from when he sends to his first appointment. He looks like a nice guy, right? He was not a nice guy. These are actual busts of him, of what he looked like, too. He was a ruthless, paranoid, capricious ruler. He would execute his enemies on the least word of an informant. He believed that all governors were grasping. No one could trust his favor. Seneca says you could always tell who his aides were. They were the ones with the long, drawn, white faces. He imposed the death penalty for anyone who criticized anything he'd said or done. He'd kill you. If you wore robes like him, he would kill you. If you happened by accident to have honors voted to you on the same day that got voted to him, he would kill you. And he'd kill you savagely. He would drag you by hooks through the streets and then take your body and dump it in the Tiber River and let the fish eat it. He'd bring you to the top of the Temple of Diana and throw you downstairs and watch you roll and writhe and break every bone in your body and then club you and beat you and drag you some more. That's who Pilate's boss was. That's who he's thinking, this could happen to me. It's happened to plenty of other people. Pilate, behold your king. Away with him, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar. What a bald-faced lie. They hated Caesar, and yet here they are testifying this. Pilate gives up. The death sentence isn't recorded, but the usual practice was you had to specify the mode of death. It was given from the judgment seat, as we mentioned before. If you said it in Latin, in the normal place in Rome, you'd say ibis in crucem, which means you shall mount the cross. That was the usual announcement. And you would, again, carry out the sentences immediately. No appeal. Nothing. You're done. Next case. Call it. This happened around noon. John says it was about the 6th hour when Pilate had sat down on the judgment seat. And that becomes amazingly significant, as we'll see when we come to the end here. But he dispatched a crucifixion team, and then what did he do? Go to lunch? Nice old Roman lunch. Sat down, said, nah, my case is done for the day. I sentenced him, a couple other guys, now I'm going to go eat. Let's talk about the crucifixion, though. Kind of a grisly matter, and it's worth doing, though, because it happened to our Lord and Savior, who went through it for us. But whether this Pilate was sitting here on a judgment seat or up here on a judgment seat, in any case, they took a walk through the streets to right here. This is where Calvary was. It was in a quarry. There was a garden nearby. There was a little hill, and it was outside the walls, which is why in Hebrews we say Jesus died outside the gate to sanctify the people by his own blood, which is richly symbolic in so many ways, going back through Jewish tradition. There were 4 soldiers under the command of a centurion. They were probably members of an auxiliary cohort at the time. Along the way, he meets this guy, Simon of Cyrene, mentioned in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He's a Christian by tradition. He had sons, 2 of them we know by name, Alexander and Rufus. He was pressed into service, so apparently he didn't want to go, as you can imagine. And he was from Cyrene. So if you're ever on Jeopardy and somebody says, quick, where's Cyrene? And you know where that is, you're going to go dink, dink, dink. It's that place in the Mediterranean, right? It's one of those islands right here. Cyprus, wrong. Crete, wrong. No, Cyrene is over here, which is Libya, the land of Muammar Gaddafi. This is where Cyrene is, right there, up in the top. Of course, Alexandria in Egypt is over there, but it was a fair measure away. So Simon the Libyan is how we should know of him. Was he Jewish? Well, a lot of speculation. Simon's a Greek name, and he has 2 kids. One he names Alexander, which is a Greek name, and the other he names Rufus, which is a Roman name. But we also know from the Acts of the Apostles that it was a Cyrenian synagogue in Jerusalem. So anyhow, if you want to speculate about a lot of these things, it's interesting. But this much is probably revealing about a lot of things. It says he was coming in from the agros, which means the field or the country. Simon was coming in the field. Why was he doing that? He was probably working. Why was he coming in at noon if he was working? Passover. You get off at noon at Passover. So he's coming in. He's ready for the feast. He's thinking, I got to get home. I got to slaughter some lambs. I got to get got to help the wife with the cooking. And they say, no, you're coming with me. You got to help this condemned guy. You can see why he'd be pressed into service for that. Along the way, too, we meet this figure, Veronica. This is a name, she's not mentioned in the Gospels. She was the one who wiped Jesus' face on the way to Calvary. Her name is what's called a portmanteau. Her name is derived from what she did. So Vera, icon, Veronica, Vera, true image, because she wiped Jesus' face and got the image on the cloth. I always think it's interesting look at this as a historical method because there's a lot of interesting history behind it. There are plenty of legends about her. Her name comes to us because of these apocryphal works that were done in the 4th century that are apparently preserving some kind of tradition. As I mentioned, last time we get the names of Mary's parents, Anne and Joachim, because they're mentioned there. We get the story of Veronica from there too. Some say that she was the woman who had an issue of blood in the scriptures and that she had cured Tiberius and given a cloth to Pope St. Clement. Some said she was the wife of Zacchaeus, who had evangelized France. Some said she was actually Martha, the sister of Lazarus. She was also a rich legend involving her as the princess of Edessa and the wife of a Roman officer. But her veil really has some interesting mysteries and miracles that attach to it. One thing we know for terms of chain of custody is that it appeared in Rome in about 705 to 07 under Pope John VII, and it was kept in the Vatican there. It was stolen from St. Peter's in about 1600 when they were doing renovations. And in 1999, a Jesuit priest by the name of Father Pfeiffer, who'd been doing a lot of research on it, claimed that it was relocated to the Abbey of Monopolo in Italy over the years when they were doing the renovations in St. Peter's. Pope Benedict XVI visited this, and he lends credence to the issue. That's the image in the background. What makes the image interesting is a couple of things. Number one is it shows the eyes open. Now, all the art of Veronica's veil before 1600 shows, I'm talking about artists who drew a picture of the veil with the eyes open. The veil that came in the Vatican after that had the eyes closed, and all the art after that shows the eyes closed. But in this abbey, this has a consistent chain. It's also interesting because the facial features match in great detail the image on the shroud in terms of the shape of the nose, the eyebrows, the chin, and mouth and cheeks. Anyhow, it's just so much, right, that we could talk about, but even that is worth a lot. Crucifixion. Gospels don't say anything about it, the form of the cross, how he was affixed, or the amount of pain he was endured. But we know it happened, and it was not a fun experience. Everything we know through history, in fact, was something that people from ancient history didn't even like to talk about. So we get snippets of it here and there because it was something so ugly and dirty that people didn't even like to write about it. It began in about the year 700 BC in Athens, in Greece, where they found this is a great way to keep pirates from being pirates. We'll crucify them. In 400 BC, the Greeks started spreading the use. They found, hey, this is a pretty effective deterrent. Let's keep using it. 200 BC, the Romans say, great idea. Romans are always borrowing stuff from the Greeks. They decide to use this as punishment for slaves and foreigners, never for citizens. No citizen would ever get crucified. That's how bad it was, is that it was reserved only for the lowest classes. In 4 BC, 2,000 Jews were crucified. They said all along the way outside of Jerusalem, along the main road leading out, you could see bodies hung up on crosses. Again, this is 4 BC. This is so when you hear about Jesus talking to his followers and saying, "Pick up your cross and follow me," everybody then living either remembered this event or knew someone who remembered this event. As you can imagine, this had been done only 30 years before. You would have heard about it. Remember that time they crucified 2,000 Jews along the road, and they put them up there as a public spectacle. Again, deterrent. Don't do what they did, or you're next. And so, pick up your cross and follow me was something that they understood. Cicero, a most cruel and disgusting penalty. Seneca, the accursed tree. Josephus, the most pitiable of deaths. Form of crucifixion was not terribly regulated. Any will do. There's the Latin cross, as we see. The St. Anthony cross is a T. The Greek cross, and then the St. Andrew's cross. The idea was, it doesn't have to be any particular shape. It just needs to be done so that people don't ever do it again. Jesus' cross, the likely shape is this. Well, why? Are we just speculating? No. They put up above his head the charge. So that'd be a place where they put it, right? So again, every word that appears in the Passion narrative has some meaning or purpose we can draw from it, and that's why the cross that we have right there, allows for that, because they put the charge above his head. Now, a lot of art shows Jesus carrying a full cross. That didn't happen. What was typically happen is they carry the crossbar, and they'd strap it to their shoulders or put it on their back or carry it behind them, dragging it or whatever it was, but the stakes would typically be in the ground, and then they would lift it up by forked poles and put it on there either in the T form or in the regular cruciform. How high was the cross? Well, it was low enough that animals could ravage the victims on it. And for Jesus, we know that a reed had to be used to raise wine to his lips, so it had to be more than, 6 feet high. So what, 7 feet maybe? They had to use a reed to get it up there. How was he affixed? Well, again, the Romans weren't terribly wedded to means error. They could tie you up there. They could nail you to the crossbeam, whatever they felt they needed to do. They would lift you up by forked poles and then put you on there. And sometimes they put a footrest there or a seat, and they often would, because they want to make your time as long as possible. Enjoy your stay. Sit here. Enjoy this. You know what? Because the more comfortable we can make you, the more uncomfortable we're going to make you in the long term. That's how mean they were when they did this. The usual understanding for, at least the modern understanding of how they would affix nails would be through the wrist, because it would catch on the bones there and hold somebody up. And same way in the feet, is it would in the feet and it would catch on the bones, and it would give some traction there. There was in the 1980s, they found, doing it in Jerusalem, they're doing excavations, and the Jewish authorities there found a crucifixion victim dating to this first century. They have very, very little historical evidence, archaeological evidence for this, but this is one of the great findings. And according to Jewish tradition, you don't put these in, this is somebody's body, so you don't put it in a museum so we can stare at it. You bury it and you commend it to God. But they took it out long enough to make pictures of it. And there's been plenty of studies, but the particular bone here was a heel bone. You could see they didn't care much about whether the bone was going to go through the foot or not. Whatever it takes to get her done, that's what they would do. And so they put this here, and they even see that the nail was bent on the other side to make sure it wouldn't come through. Now, we know that Jesus had nails. So, because the risen Christ says, "See my hands and my feet." And Psalm 22 says, "They've pierced my hands and my feet." Did he have 3 nails? Well, early Christian art said he had 4, but that was before St. Helen of Constantine visited Jerusalem, and through miraculous intervention, so the early Christians claim, she found 3. And so since then, Christian art has tended to show Christ with 3 nails that he was pierced with. Of course, the movie, as you saw, had the other issue is, did the nails go through the hands or through the wrists? Well, there's evidence it could go both ways. We know that hands generally wouldn't support the weight unless you tied the arms, which they could have done. Thomas the Apostle says he won't believe until he sees Jesus' hands. So some people have said, see, he was pierced in the hands. Well, the word he used for hands also could include wrists. And then again, the early art showed pierced hands until after the shroud. After the shroud came along and people started the shroud, they started doing art with the nails in the wrists. So you can see that there too. Clear blood stain on the wrists, and well, I don't have a shot of the feet to see. Hey, by the way, in case you're interested, because I am, I figure if I'm interested, other people will be interested. But what about stigmatists, right? What about Padre Pio and others, St. Francis? Well, you know what? Life's messy, and so are stigmatists. They get wounds in the hands or the wrists. It just doesn't matter. So Padre Pio, there he has them in the hands. Does that mean that Jesus got pierced in the hands? No, but because it's all mystical, and it's not the point about the exact location anatomically. It's about the suffering that was involved. St. Francis, his stigmata was extraordinarily unique because the nails protruded from his skin. It wasn't as if he had holes; that they actually popped out from where he was. Now, along with Jesus were a couple others, Dismas and Gestas. They were 2 other bandits, 2 other lesti, who were crucified with him, 2 other robbers. They had their trial that day in front of Pilate, too. So Jesus wasn't the only case that Pilate was hearing. We get their names from the Acts of the Apostles, or Acts of Pilate, which is that 4th century work I mentioned. And we have this item too, is that when they had crucified him, they parted his garments among them, casting lots. Lots, what are lots? Well, the word the Romans used for that was sortes, they call it, which are little tablets or counters made of either wood or rock. And they basically throw them into an urn, soldier's helmet, and then you draw them out at random and throw like dice. And so these are actual dice that Romans would use, and they'd figure out ways to see how the gods would ordain their luck and their o fortuna in determining it. And they used these to gamble for Jesus' garments. We know that he would have, that as average Jewish male, he would have had a head covering, sandals, a belt, outer garment, and an inner garment, which is seamless, which of course raises all kinds of wonderful mystical observations, because it was the seamless garment that couldn't be rent in two, and they had to gamble for. Let's go back to Pilate, because I don't want to press us for time. After the sentence, he had plenty of unfinished business. He had to meet with the aggrieved Jews over the signage. They didn't like the fact that it said Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And he dismissed their complaints. What I've written, I've written. You can see he's getting his comeuppance too, again. Then he had to meet with Jews about the bodies on the crosses. And he had to order that the legs of the victims be broken, right? These are more orders. You can imagine he's at lunch and they say, these guys are back here again. Why do they want, you know? And he's got more orders yet. Joseph of Arimathea pops up. He orders a centurion. So, you know, he says, I'd like his body. He says, well, I'm going to send a centurion to confirm Jesus' death. So the centurion has to go. And he comes back. He says, yes, he died. I put a sword in his side. So he says, Joseph, you can have Jesus' body. Joseph says, fine. So he goes out and he buys 100 pounds of myrrh and aloes, along with Nicodemus, who had first come to him by night, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes about 100 pounds weight. Sorry, just a quick historical side note, because I always find this interesting. Like, how do they know it's 100 pounds, right? Well, it was 100 Roman pounds. And a Roman pound is equal to 11.5 ounces, and 100 pounds equals about 73 pounds. So when you hear, so some translations will actually say they brought about 75 pounds of these mixtures, and some just assume that we're all supposed to know it means Roman pounds when it says that. But what it meant was that this was for an extremely lavish royal burial. It was very comparable to Mary of Bethany when she spread the jar of ointment that was 300 days' wages, and that Judas complained about. How dare you spend all this money on him? This was another lavish sign of affection for Christ. Myrrh, in case you didn't know, is sap from a myrrh tree, so you can still buy it in the Middle East there if you want it, but that's what the tree looks like. And the word says aloes, but for you botanists out there, it's really not aloe vera, so don't think I used to think, oh, it's a nice aloe vera plant, right? I like that too. No, it's the term was actually used for the sandalwood tree, which looked like this, and it was highly aromatic, so you could chop it up into little pieces, or you could pulverize it and get a powder. But anyhow, he brought out 75 pounds of both of those, and then he put it along with his body, and they draped the shroud over that, and they put it there, and then they were going to wait out the Sabbath and then come back on early Sunday morning to finish the burial business. But Pilate has even more orders. He meets with the chief priests and the Pharisees regarding the security term. Can you imagine this guy thinking, what now when they show up on his door again? I can't get rid of these guys, right? But they say, we need a guard at the tomb because they say this guy's going to rise from the dead. Can you imagine what Pilate's thinking? Okay, I'll give you a centurion. Yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you. Why? Why did you have a centurion go watch a dead guy? Was he hedging bets? I don't know. And what do you think he thought on Sunday morning when the word comes back to him? Hey, your centurion freaked out. He saw some bright angels there, and the stone, rolled back, and an earthquake happened. Did you hear the ground shake this morning, Pilate? Now, Pilate's postscript. Quick story about this is the last thing we know about him from history, is that sometime after Jesus' death, that there was a pseudo-prophet who had gathered a bunch of followers in Samaria up in the north. And Pilate sends out a detachment of troops. And what happens when you get a bunch of people who are excited about something because they thought they found some sacred relics of Moses? You get a bunch of soldiers around, you get a bunch of people, and you get a fight. And when soldiers have swords, the rioters don't, and who gets killed? The rioters do. And you can imagine there's the Samaritans. And they're thinking, are you kidding me? We're friends with you. We hate the Jews too. And you sent a detachment up here to kill us? How dare you? So they complained to Pilate's boss, the Syrian governor, and says, Pilate, I don't have your back on this one. You need to go to Rome and you need to talk to Tiberius about what you did here, because I got the Samaritans all over me and they're supposed to be our friends and you just blew it. So Pilate then goes to Rome. This is Vitellius who orders this, and he has to account for this. Now, Tiberius dies on March 16th. What day is today? Pretty close, huh? March 16th, 37 AD. Tiberius dies while Pilate's on his way there. He's lost to history. We have no idea what happened to him after that. There's a wonderful book. It's called Pontius Pilate by Rowe. It's a British writer. Came out about 6-7 years ago, and she goes through everything we could know about Pilate and from folklore on, and how his legend has been treated over the years. Some say it was a suicide. Some say it was banishment. He was executed, martyred, retired to some villa in France. We don't really know. No one knows. And there are all kinds of strongly held competing legends regarding this. What's interesting is that in some circles, he was known as a saint. Tertullian, early church father, said he had the heart of a Christian. In the Coptic church, in the 6th, 7th century, he was given as a baptismal name. Don't get too excited about it, because the historians point out that the Coptics did that because they were particularly anti-Semitic at the time, and so they thought it would really be good to name their kids Pilate. In the Abyssinian church, they recognize Pontius Pilate and Claudia Procula as saints. In the Greek church, they recognize Claudia only on October 27th. But there are also legends that he was exiled to Vienne in southern Gaul, Lausanne in Switzerland. People to this day say if you go to Lucerne and hike up Mount Pilatus, it's really spooky. There are lots of traditions, and they say he haunts southern Germany. Who knows? I believe in hauntings, so I don't want to go to those places. But what's interesting about him in retrospect is that he's mentioned in the very earliest of the Christian creeds that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate. That was done very specifically to remind people that this God who became flesh and came to earth did so at a specific point in history, and it was not an illusion. It was not an illusion. It was a very real thing, and it fixes Jesus' death at this event.